Welcome to the New Discovery Christian Podcast, where you'll find Bible messaging and sermons that will encourage, uplift, and challenge you to a godlier life. Join our community and become inspired to continue living a God-directed life.
Welcome to the New Discovery Podcast. This is Kyle and Zach coming to you again late in the evening here in Hernando. Thank you for being a part of this podcast. We thank you for coming on this journey with us. And just real quickly, we just ask that you give us a like, you subscribe to us, hit the bell button. We ask that you put a review for us on...
A good review?
Yeah, a good review. And, you can be critical of us. That's okay. Just don't be too harsh on us with a little grace. So we just ask that, and that you share this with anyone that you know that especially could really benefit them in their lives and whatever they're going through. And maybe they tune into YouTube, maybe they turn into videos like these, and it's very beneficial to their lives. So we just ask that, and it really helps us a whole lot. I mean, we're out there with a whole bunch of big dogs on YouTube and iTunes and Google, so that just helps to get the message out there and the gospel out and reaching to other people. So thank you.
Well said, brother.
Appreciate you. So today what we're going to talk about is what we alluded to the last time that we were going over in our podcast series. It has to do with scripture, and it has to do with memorization. So that's specifically what we're going to go over with Jesus today, is what did it mean to Jesus with scripture and memorizing it? So that's what we're going to talk about. So one thing, for instance, about Jesus and his early beginnings when it comes to scripture is that we know that he quoted from scripture very, very often within his ministry. He knew and understood the scriptures. And in a way that he needed to know how to do that, he did not have the collection of the books of the Bible within, a Bible very easily and put in here with paper. It wasn't like that back then. He couldn't carry ancient scrolls, which the Jewish people still have today. You can even look them up. They're somewhat of about this size, sometimes even bigger, and can get, very, very thick. And that's one book. That's like Isaiah. Just imagine having the entire Old Testament.
He'd better have a big suitcase or a big backpack.
Right, yeah.
Get that camel out, carry some of them
donkey
things.
out, He better have that donkey out there carrying a bunch of them. But we know that wasn't the case.
I don't think so.
Yeah, he wasn't carrying all those scrolls around. And we also know that he didn't just quote from a few of his favorite passages from Scripture, and he just quotes them, for God so loved the world. Of course, that's within the New Testament, but he wasn't just quoting his little favorite passages that everyone kind of knew and shared, and it was well known. It wasn't like that with the scriptures for Jesus. His ministry was infused, and the understanding of what's going on with the scriptures was infused with the proper use of scripture, and using God's authoritative word against people who predominantly had their own traditions, and the scriptures justifying those, rather than their lives being justified by the scriptures.
Yeah, so I know a lot of people think, and even when I was younger and early in the church, I was sort of intimidated by the Bible. Even if I had a children's Bible, I still didn't fully grasp the message and everything that I believe God was trying to get across. But really, when did Jesus start diving into the scriptures, learning the scriptures, even memorizing the scriptures? And do you think that people, even depending on their age, even if they're 8, 9 years old, do you think it really matters how old you are to when you dive into those scriptures and start learning those?
One thing that we're alluded to in the scriptures is that Jesus' beginnings with the scriptures were no different than any other Jewish child, and the requirements by the Torah, the Old Testament, and the law was to be fulfilled under a few different areas. One specifically that we'll go over, but it had to do with the interactions between his parents within the household. That's the direct leadership and grouping that Jesus is placed in on a daily basis, and that's the most core part. But he also had public readings within the synagogue. The synagogues would also do interpretations of those scriptures. So that's very similar to what we have in a sermon. That's an interpretation of the scriptures being used, not a bulk of scripture being read, which is different. But they had something like that. They had someone skilled in teaching within the synagogues. But he had his own personal study. We understand that from Jesus's understanding of scripture, he had his own personal study with the scriptures, and walking through them and talking about them, because some of them had nothing to do with what other people thought, other people said. He had his own study that was going on, and then those reflections are shown through his ministry. One thing that's also very important to talk about in this is Jesus's beginnings, because again, we're talking about Jesus as a person and not God, which is what we went over in the first part to this series, is that Jesus is both fully man and fully God, but we are talking about Jesus as fully man, which is very important as being on our example. So Hebrews 5:8 says here, it says son, and this is talking about Jesus. The son, though he learned obedience from what he suffered. So we hear that he learned obedience over time. So I want that to just sit with the audience, is that Jesus was obedient and he learned. I think that's really important for us to sit on that one. Now in 4:15, it also says this, and this is why it's important about Jesus learning and the obedience attached to that. Because 4:15, right above this in Hebrews says, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weakness." And he's talking about Jesus. "But we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin." He can empathize with our weaknesses. Why? Because Jesus was growing in his own life. And then I think Matthew 24 really, wraps the rest of this up before we can continue, because I think it's really important that all of us know this and that there's not a lot of confusion. So this is Jesus after he had gone. Okay, so this is Jesus towards the end of his ministry. And we had talked about Gnosticism before, and to summarize it up, it was a heretical teaching, and the main thing about it is that there was a secret knowledge being attached to this and with Christianity. This kind of puts this at bay, because this is Jesus speaking about his return, and he says, "But about that day or hour," he's talking about his second return, "no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son," talking about himself, "but only the Father." And why I bring that up is because there's a misconception that Jesus knew everything in his humanly form. And as far as what we know right there is that Jesus didn't know everything. And then, in fact, him learning obedience, assumes that you don't know certain things. And there's other passages that we'll go over later that assumes Jesus as not knowing everything, but is in growing. Now, without sin, that's very important. Jesus is also God. He was without sin. Now, one thing that's really, really important, because we've already talked about his early life, the passing down predominantly within scriptures, as you notice, the parents are a big cornerstone in this, but it's not the case necessarily today. Children's ministries have been placed in a situation where they are predominantly giving and passing down the scriptures within our culture today. However, that is not God's plan. God's initial plan since the beginning is the passing down of scripture through the family, and as a side note, predominantly through the father.
Yeah, and I made a note when you were talking about the scripture. I believe, did you say it was Hebrews, that first scripture?
Hebrews.
Yeah,
yes.
And you said he learned, and I was writing down a note when you were saying that, and you did touch on it about meaning that means he didn't know everything. A lot of people we'll think that, yeah, Jesus was fully God, fully man. Oh, he knew everything coming down here, and that's why he was in the synagogue when he was a young man, and he was impressing all the teachers in the synagogue when Mary and Joseph couldn't find him, and they think he just knew everything. No, he had just gained that knowledge based on Scripture. He had gained that knowledge from since he was a little kid to then, and then going into that. So the parents, what role should a good parent play in raising his or her child now, and how can we compare that to how Jesus's parents, how they played a factor in his journey and growing in the Scripture?
So one thing that I'll note on is just, what you said is another scripture just comes to mind, is when Jesus talked about how he did not consider equality with the Father something to be grasped, and he says that within his own ministry, and he says to his disciples, whether he says it to the crowds, I don't remember. Yeah, anyone can correct me on that, and you can put that in the comments where that is specifically. But Jesus did not find equality with the Father to be grasped, even though he could. He did not, and Jesus says, "I came to serve, not to be served." Because if Jesus had that equality with the Father, how that exact equality, how could he be our example if he's all powerful, all knowing? He couldn't be our example because all his actions would revolve around being all knowing, being all powerful. Now, did he have power? Did he have knowledge? Absolutely. And I think anyone who says he didn't is ignorant of the Scriptures, I think. But he was not all powerful nor all knowing, because he could not be that example to us. But he's still all fully God and full human, so it's a mystery that we're not ever going to fully solve. That was a big thing within first century. But when it comes to the family, though, the role of godly parents, Jesus's parents, very specifically, they took responsibility to train Jesus, and they took that upon themselves. And we see that example of them taking him to the temple when he was very young, which is within the law. They fulfilled the law to go there during ceremonial feasts. We also know that both of them are godly parents as well. And one thing that's very interesting, just, this isn't about Mary and Joseph, but one thing we hear about Joseph is when God's talking to him and commanding him, you never hear Joseph talk. Joseph is just obedient to the Lord and just follows what the Lord wants him to do. And when it comes to Mary and thinking when she was going to divorce him, he could have slapped her upside the face. That could have been in Scripture. Could have thrown her out in the crowd and, told everyone, spit on her, punched her, everyone's stoned her now. He could have done that within that society, and no one would have blamed him. But what does he do? He says he tries to put her away silently. And that shows a measure of grace that he's giving over to her. Now, is he going to put up with if she actually cheated on him? No. That's not very wise of him. But he was going to do it gracefully. So he's a man of obedience and a man of grace. And then we know that Mary was very faithful to Jesus all the way to the cross. And she has a song of obedience and talking to the Lord. And we just know that God put him within a godly family. And that responsibility, they took it up. And what we can see is that fruit of that, they trained him up. And so when we read, so we've already talked about Jesus' childhood now. So we got to bring up when Jesus was within the temple and he's 12 years old, he's impressing the leaders. We kind of need to talk about that.
So it was 12 years old. I got that right, I think.
Yeah, you got that right. 12 years old. And now the inclination, again, is what we talked about, is that Jesus he's 12 years old. He has to have some kind of secret knowledge now. I mean, come on, he's impressing the leaders. That's got to be the case. But we have no inclination that Jesus has any kind of secret knowledge that's going on there when he's young. In fact, what it appears to be is that Jesus is setting an example and being young here, and that is a way better example that we need to take advantage of what's happening here with Jesus, is that this began early on because of having godly parents and leading to where he is today. Did it have to do with his own resourcefulness? Absolutely. I think he had to take responsibility with getting the Scriptures himself and not just purely relying on other people.
Yeah, hard work.
Hard work, exactly. And so I think there's more Scripture on the side of this than I think there is over there being secret knowledge. And if someone wants to correct me on the secret knowledge, they can, you can let us know.
Get in the comment box.
Yeah, get in the comment box. I mean, I'm not all knowing, I'm just trying to.
I ain't even close.
Yeah, I'm just trying to learn here too. I mean, that's what this is all about. So after that episode with the temple, we have this. And I think this kind of confirms this, I believe, and especially coming right after this, and it's not even another part of scripture. So after that whole temple scene, it says, as 12 years old onward, and Jesus grew in wisdom and stature. So he didn't have all-knowing wisdom, apparently. Somehow, it grew. So that's what the scriptures say. Along with the stature, in the same way, it was incremental. So was the stature, it wasn't all at once. So was the wisdom. And it says, in the favor with God and man. So his favor with God and people, the two greatest commandments, love God and love others, somehow that love continued to grow. We certainly know that obedience did. I'm a lot more inclining on that for sure, as it talks about, in Hebrews that we just went over, it talks about he learned obedience. So I think that's in motion too. So I think that's very important that we went over that and what it looks like in Jesus as he grows older. So I think it's fair to say that Jesus' understanding came from godly parents, and it was also because of godly discipline within his life. I think it's very fair to say that.
And I think it just shows the importance, of knowing scripture, having it memorized, knowing the truth. One, when the world tries to tell you something different, you have the scripture to lean on. Two, when somebody else, maybe even a friend or a family member tries to tell you something different, you have that to lean on. And then three, maybe the devil, one of his demons, or are trying to get you entangled in sin in your life, trying to tell you something that's not in scripture. You've got it to lean on right there too. So that's the importance of knowing the truth, and there's a lot of comfort that comes with that.
I think that's very good that you mentioned that, because we've already talked about how Jesus' brothers already tempt him in a very, and that the Satan was using him to be tempted, and that's a very great point. Is
we talked about that last time.
You can't just you can't just be relying on one route here. You have to have this all encompassing full tools behind your belt of getting the scriptures onto you, and you can't just rely on one mode of these, because people and things can let you down, and Satan can use them. So, but the next part of why it's really, really important with Jesus in the scriptures is that Jesus understood the difference between the content and context of scripture versus the traditions within his day, and he understood those distinctions a whole lot better than I think we understand today. And some of those just popular understandings, it goes very, very deep. We're not even going to talk about Revelation here in a minute. So there's a lot of traditions that go around, and there's not a distinction between the two. And Jesus did that way better than we did. So one of those, for instance, is Mary Magdalene. People just automatically says she's a prostitute. That we don't know that. But we just say that though. And then she anointed Jesus for burial. We still don't actually know that. That's not something the scriptures actually say. We say that. There was 3 wise men. Again, that's what we say. There's no room for them in the Bethlehem hotel. And we just assume it's some kind of hotel or something like that. Though the scriptures don't say that. So you heard something from someone else, but that's not what the scriptures actually said. And then Revelation is such a rabbit hole of going down there, and the amount of traditions. John, one of our head minister here, he saw a sign that said, if you don't believe in this tradition of Revelation, you're not welcome here. I'll just let that speak for itself. So the only way forward is the way that Jesus did this. Jesus dove in headfirst into the scriptures to know them firsthand for himself.
Yep. And if you don't dive in firsthand and you try to get your little nitpick verses, like a popular one when you were talking about all the spots in scripture where people are taking them out of context, like the no room in the inn, the 3 wise men, like Jeremiah. Someone can comment in the comment box the specific verse in Jeremiah, but it's talking about I have plans for you to prosper, plans for you to essentially be okay. And people cling to that verse when they're going through tough times. And I'm not bashing people who do that, but they have to realize that that verse, isn't written to you specifically. That verse was written to Joshua, I believe, letting him know that his people would one day reach the promised land. Am I speaking correct on that?
You're talking about Jeremiah?
Jeremiah, that's it. Yeah, it's in Jeremiah. And it was when they were exiled out of the promised land, and he was letting them know that they would one day be able to return, giving them hope for that.
Yes, it wasn't under Joshua, but you're completely correct, though. The context is these people have been exiled and are wondering, is God still for us? Yeah. And then that's where that comes out of, is reminding you in the midst of all of that, of exile, I'm still for you. I'm faithful to you. I'm faithful to the covenant. And that's mostly where that's coming from.
Okay. I thought about that when you were talking about that, and just people taking verses and using them for themselves. So
that's very good, because you could take it out of context, and just whatever happens in my life and God interacting with it is just, he's going to make me happy. And I think that's where that comes from. Now, does God want the best for you? Yes, but the issue is that actually, believe it or not, you don't actually always want what's best for you. That's something I've had to deal with in my own life. I actually don't act in a way that's best for me, but God does. So the problem is, you actually don't always know what's best for you. So that has nothing to do with happiness. That has to do with God talking to you. But that's a whole podcast in itself, there.
I kind of went off track on there. My bad.
No, that's good. Because that's a perfect example right there. Now, also one thing that's important is Jesus even challenged his own leaders within that day whether they actually had an accurate view of Scripture. So that's another thing of Jesus actually understanding what it was versus what some kind of tradition is. And the Pharisees, we could go down a big rabbit hole of traditions and
their robes and their tassels and their head dresses and
their long prayers and making them look so good. Rules so they don't break rules. I mean, it's such a rabbit pit going down there. It's so huge. But Jesus, see, they didn't like him for that. I mean, he even died because of it. So, So one thing that we could take away from this is one of the astonishing things of Jesus' discipline was the comprehensive knowledge of the Scriptures. He had a well-rounded understanding of the Scriptures, more than just proof texts against something just maybe that someone says, and, here's this text, or familiar books that you just like. Jesus went way beyond that. It was very, again, comprehensive, all of them very well rounded out with the Scriptures, and knowing, again, the context and how it drew to his life and his ministry. I mean, that's really the main things. We want to thank you for tuning in with us today, because this is a part 1 of a part 2 series, because it's too all-encompassing to go over Jesus in Scripture and what that has to do with him, because, I mean, he's just loaded up with the Scripture and such. I mean, it's like running through his blood. I mean, we gotta do justice by 2 parts. So thank you for tuning in for this part, but tune in to part 2 with us when we go into the specifics of Jesus, the actual verses, and we're going to talk about allusions and alluding to Scripture and what that has to mean. So thank you for tuning into this one. Again, hit the like button, subscribe to us, comment on there, comment on what we're doing right, comment on maybe if we missed something. I mean, I'm sure it's very, very possible that
if there's a button, click it.
Yeah, if there's a button, click it for us. Maybe not the block button.
Oh, yeah.
You don't have to hit that one. But yeah, most of the other buttons is good with us. So thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you on part 2. Thank you.